Hello, welcome everyone to another episode here on LLD Conversations. I'm your host for today, David Brackett, and I'm super excited today because we have a very special guest here joining us, Jace Norton from Maya Bridge, who's going to be joining, and also have some big news to share with you all about the LLD Work Group. So I'm going to introduce Jace in just a moment, but before I do, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory on how did the LLD Work Group get started, what has been happening, and what is to come here with LLD. So, Jace, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so I'm gonna pass over to Jason here just a moment. So, but before I do that, I got a phone call about a little over 3 years ago from Ileana, and she was interested in asking me if I would be willing to help out with leading the LLD work group. There was some transition happening at the time, and they needed someone to take the leadership over. And so I said, of course, when someone calls you like that, you say yes. And so I jumped in, and then so basically, I've been the chair of the LLD work group for the last 3 years. So what is the LLD work group, and what exactly do we do? Well, our vision and our purpose is ultimately to be a thought leader and help represent languages of limited diffusion that don't get a lot of recognition, training opportunities. So we highlight trainers, we highlight linguists, so that those languages that represent languages of limited diffusion have better opportunities to excel, to become certified, to create more opportunities for interpreters, and ultimately to help benefit the end users, right? The patients and those individuals receiving the services. So there's not a lot of work groups, or groups for that matter, that focus on those languages. So that's one of the things that really drew me to it. I've always been enamored with languages of limited diffusion as well, and love learning about other cultures. And so it was a great fit. And so for the last, a little over 3 years now, I've been able to lead with many different volunteers. We've had a large village of volunteers that have come and gone and helped out. Some of the things that we've started have been the LLD Conversations, which has been the biggest part now of the work group, where we've been able to interview thought leaders, trainers, interpreters that represent languages of limited diffusion, and ultimately to inspire other linguists, other trainers to be able to take their profession to the next level. So that's what we've been doing. And after 3 years now, it's time for me to pass on the baton, which I'm really excited to share with you all, that we are going to be passing the baton over to Mr. Jace Norton from Maya Bridge, and he's going to be the new chair of the LLD Conversation. So we reached out to Jace based on his background, based on his leadership, based on his interests, his desires, his passion for languages of limited diffusion. Asked him if he would be interested, and he was, and was wanting to learn more. And we met with him. Ileana and I met with him and talked to him about this is what it would entail. And he was all over it, super excited. And so today we're gonna get to interview Jace a little bit, ask him about his passion and why he's excited about taking it to the next step. So without further ado, Jace, thank you so much for being here. If you could just do a quick intro of yourself and talk about why it is that you're excited to be taking this next chapter on.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, thanks so much again, David. I really appreciate it. And I'm really grateful to NCIHC for this opportunity. This is something that is, really near and dear to my heart. My involvement with sort of indigenous and lower diffusion language access stems from having learned an indigenous language fluently. I lived in Guatemala for 2 years as a missionary for my church. And during that time, I was assigned mostly to live and work in the areas where the people spoke a language called Quechua. And Quechua is one of 30 indigenous Mayan languages that are still actively spoken today throughout Mexico and Guatemala. And I learned this language and kind of discovered my love for language learning in general, but specifically my love for these sort of underrepresented languages throughout all the world, right? I kind of came to appreciate just how cool languages are in general, but especially these languages that, like you said, don't get much of a spotlight, are relatively, unknown in terms of most of the world, thinks of, when they think of like a Mayan language, for example, most people think, oh, well, that's, you would only be really encountering that if you're an archaeologist. Most people kind of assume that these are dead languages and that nobody speaks them anymore. And the reality is that, there's millions, hundreds of millions of speakers of different indigenous languages from around the world. And that's what I've come to learn. As I returned home from Guatemala, I was recruited to be an interpreter for the Quechua language, specifically for immigration hearings. And even I, having lived with Quechua people and, had a lot more exposure than the average American with these languages and with Quechua specifically, I never would have imagined that there would be that many speakers of this language who had migrated here to the United States. So I was pretty shocked to see that there was that much demand for interpretation for speakers of Quechua. And then as I worked as an interpreter, I could see that it wasn't just the language that I speak, it was all of the different Mayan languages, as well as all the different indigenous languages from Latin America. And then as you kind of, again, broaden your scope, you can see that it applies to languages in, Asia and Africa and, even Europe. And so really these indigenous and lower diffusion languages come from all over the world. And that's why I felt sort of compelled to do my part to sort of leverage my privilege to help speakers of indigenous and lower diffusion languages. And that's how I started my Abridged Language Services. And so we've been doing that work for over 4 years now, and we've just been delighted to have been able to make any impact at all. And we've been very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time for a lot of different situations so that we can help out. I have a really great team of individuals that work with me. And most of all, we have a wonderful team of over 500 different interpreters in indigenous languages. So I'm really excited to chair this committee because, again, this is something that I've been working on advocating more for over the last 4 years as I've worked through Maya Bridge. And so I often will go and speak at different conferences about the importance of recognizing and supporting indigenous language access in different, not just in healthcare, but really in every field. But it's extremely important, especially in situations like healthcare, where we don't have the luxury of being able to always pre-schedule an interpreter for these languages of lower diffusion. And so we worked really hard to become the resource that can handle on-demand requests for even really difficult to source indigenous languages. And thankfully, I think, we've been able to do a good job of that. So sort of my vision for what I would like to do with this committee specifically is to kind of build on what's already being done, to continue to spotlight the real heroes in indigenous and lower diffusion language access, the interpreters who are, doing the work day in and day out. And then also to kind of, like you said, to provide better training and resources for people who are interpreting into indigenous languages and lower diffusion languages, where we don't have as many resources, and it's not, as simple, perhaps, as a language like Spanish, for example. When we're talking about indigenous and lower diffusion, in many cases, we're talking about communities who have limited exposure to a lot of the concepts that we're needing to interpret, which is true of any, even speakers of English, right? When we go to the doctor, there's many times where there's complex subjects that we don't have the sort of education or familiarity to be able to understand what's being said. But with indigenous languages, we have that, and we also have a lack of ability to say those words, right? Because that concept, because it hasn't really been something discussed in that language, and there's not a lot of written materials, we're basically having to just describe what this concept is. So I would really, one of the things that we're going to work on as I sort of take the lead here will be to have webinar trainings that will help anyone who is interpreting into a lower diffusion language where we don't have as many resources to help us to gain the skills that we need to be able to interpret in the best way. And so that training will help us to, reframe a little bit our mindset to tackle what's the most important thing, right? I always, when I talk to my indigenous language interpreters and when I have interpreted in the past as well, it's not as much about knowing what word corresponds with the word in English, right, or in Spanish. It's knowing how do you describe the meaning of that, and how do you involve the provider in a way that so that they do most of the heavy lifting, right? So little tips and tricks like that. We're wanting to do more training on that, and I think it's very important to offer more training specifically in the Spanish language, especially where we have, the majority of indigenous language access, I would say, in the United States, at least in many different states and many different parts of the United States, are from Latin America. And so they are working many times with, a Spanish to target language interpreter. And so, we need to increase the accessibility for our Spanish language interpreters who are interpreting again from Spanish into an indigenous language, helping them get better training, better resources. And so when we do those webinars, we're gonna, the idea is that we will have the ability for an interpreter who doesn't speak English to be able to participate and to get that training as well. So that's something that we'll be working on. We'll also, continue to do the advocacy work with what I would say are sort of the frontline defenders of indigenous and lower diffusion language access, which typically are interpreters of dominant languages. They are the ones who are most of the time the first people that encounter individuals that have limited proficiency in a dominant language, right? So, for example, somebody that speaks a Mayan language, when they first go to the hospital, they're almost always going to be starting the conversation in Spanish, right? In likely limited Spanish proficiency. And so a Spanish interpreter very often is going to be called for that assignment. And so they're the ones that we're relying on to recognize that this individual has limited proficiency in Spanish, and then to take the appropriate actions to help try and get the best interpreter there, somebody who actually speaks the native language of that individual. So continuing to do trainings on how to recognize limited dominant language proficiency is kind of what we're calling it. And having the skills again and the confidence to take a stand and not just try and muddle through, because I think that that's traditionally sort of been the expectation from a lot of different, organizations, companies, because of a lack of resources. So getting the right training and developing those skills to be able to really take that stand, I think is very important. So we'll continue to do trainings on that. And then another thing that I really am interested in doing is trying to collect more data on how often are we seeing individuals who are using a more dominant language like Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic, but whose native language is not Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic, and trying to kind of determine how often are we sort of failing those individuals, and how can we do better, because there's really no data as it currently stands on.
That would be extremely helpful to have access to, because I think a lot of us in our industry would be very, very curious to learn that, and then we can be able to build and reverse engineer that to make sure that's not happening.
Exactly. So my sort of idea for that is to do a big survey where we survey as many interpreters of some of these dominant languages as possible. And again, we want to broaden as much as we can. It's easy to have a too narrow of a mind. So we don't just want to do Spanish, right? We want to do Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, because all of these dominant languages will have indigenous and lower diffusion language speakers who are using that language to kind of get by. And so, we've come across Russian, we've come across, all kinds of different, more dominant languages where they're using it not as their native language, but as a sort of secondary language in which they have more limited proficiency. And so the point of the survey will be to ask interpreters, to give us an estimate of how many times in the last few months have you encountered somebody who you could tell the language that you were using, Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic, was not their first language. And then kind of having them identify what were the steps that were taken. Did you identify what their native language was? Were you able to get an interpreter in that native language? What was the response from your either employer or the health organization? I think all of these responses, the idea will be to sort of, again, paint that picture to see, what is actually going on, and what in regards to healthcare and maybe other areas as well, right? Many, at least with lower diffusion languages, we don't have the luxury of only being healthcare interpreters, right? Because we really are having to work in any different area that arises. So ideally, wanting to see, when is this happening? What's the result of it? Just to give us an idea of how often it's happening. And that will help, I think, to spur action from, particularly from the organizations in healthcare, for example, who, many times it's difficult for them to see those statistics because they're not in the office when, somebody who's using Spanish with limited proficiency, all they see is, we had another Spanish assignment. And so it's difficult. That gets very, very easily lost, that information.
Very misleading. Right.
Yep. And so we're hoping to with this survey to, shed more light on that and help healthcare providers understand that this is a very common occurrence. And then, pairing that with information and data that we already have, where we know that obviously, when communities that speak lower diffusion or indigenous languages, when they have access to healthcare in their indigenous or native language, the healthcare outcomes obviously are dramatically improved. And so that's kind of the goal. And there definitely may be other things. The other thing that I'd like to mention too is that, while I'm very happy to do this, I'm thrilled to be in this position. I think it's really important to foster and train the actual indigenous interpreters and interpreters who are native speakers of lower diffusion and indigenous languages, so that eventually they can be the ones in this position, right? They need to be the ones that are really that are leading the way, right? And like I said, I'm happy to do what I can in this position, with my passion for it. But I think ultimately, the other sort of purpose of what I would like to do here is try to foster and train that generation of leaders from within those communities in healthcare interpreting specifically, to kind of take the torch, right? So that's kind of my thoughts and what I'm looking forward to.
Already planning ahead. I love it. No, it's super, super exciting, Jason. I think, you're just touching on points where you're going to really be able to raise the bar here for the NCIHC in general, and as well as the work group. So really excited. I'll continue to be a supporting role however I can here in the background and helping support Jason. And obviously this can't be done just by Jace or myself or by any, one or two or three people. So we do encourage all of those who are interested to help join. This is all volunteer, right? This is a volunteer work group. So there's no financial reimbursement involved. It's all volunteer time. Jace, who would be a good person or people that might be listening to be involved, and what would that potentially involve for them, so that they could maybe take that step of reaching out and learning more?
Absolutely. Well, like I said, I think that, I hope that anyone who speaks and interprets into a more dominant language like Spanish recognizes, again, their role in supporting indigenous and lower diffusion language access, because again, they are typically the first line of defense. So, we want you to be involved. We want you to share your stories of, when you're encountering this, we want you to, if you have any ideas of ways that we can improve things, we want to hear about it for sure. Obviously, if you are an interpreter for an indigenous language, I think that part of what we can do is just kind of centralize some resources, hopefully, and also create, important resources as well to kind of lead the way in creating those. It's really important with indigenous and lower diffusion languages. Many cases we have a lot of interpreters that interpret into an indigenous language, but because of, basically colonialism, right? Colonization of these peoples over generations, they've been basically stripped of their ability to have learned how to read and write in their indigenous language. And so many times it's only orally based, which means that when we want to create a resource to help, a group of interpreters that speak a language, we can't just do something written. We need to have an audio sort of component so that the interpreters can access that information as well. If we have individuals that speak indigenous languages who are willing to work with us to create some of these audio glossaries, I think that would also be an excellent thing. I would also say if you're a healthcare provider and you are interested in kind of the advocacy in terms of advocating from that side to make sure that we are being diligent about preparing the resource, right? I think that a lot of healthcare providers sort of have their main vendor that handles most of their languages, but then they get an indigenous language and that vendor can't support that language, at least not in the capacity that's needed. Talking about, well, what can we do to prevent that? Where can we reach out? What are the resources that do exist? And how can we, find resources? How can we establish the relationship with those resources? So really, at the end of the day, anybody that's interested in helping to ensure that speakers of indigenous and lower diffusion languages have equitable access, we want to have you, and we want you to work with us. And there's always ways that all of us can help.
There it is. You heard it first from the man himself. Anyone who's interested, please do reach out. The best way you can do that is through there's an LLD Work Group email, which we'll put here below for everyone. And of course, you can always reach out directly to Jace or to myself as well. So feel free to do that, even if you're just curious and interested, like to maybe participate, but you're not sure if you want to make that jump yet. Just schedule a conversation with Jace, and we can and see if that's the right step there for you. I also wanted to mention, I know I forgot to mention someone very, very important earlier. I mentioned Ileana, who helped me and has continued to be a mentor and is continuing to be a mentor currently for me, but also the former NCIHC president, Rosanna Ballesteri. She was also very instrumental in getting me started as the chair of the LLD Work Group. So I want to give Rosanna a big shout out. And without her support and leadership, I couldn't have done this and taken on this role. So she was extremely supportive, and love her dearly as a leader, as a mentor, and as a friend. So I want to make sure that I mentioned her as well. So with that, we're coming close to the time here, Jay. So I'm going to ask you for one last question before we wrap. If you had to leave one message to the community, what would that message be right now?
Oh man, that's a tough question. There's a lot of different topics and things that I would love to talk about. I think that again, the message is that I would love to leave is just that, especially right now, where there's quite a bit of sort of turbulence when it comes to speakers of other languages here in the United States. It's really important to continue the work that we do to ensure that nobody gets left behind, that nobody's forgotten. And it's really easy for, again, these individuals and communities that have their native languages, but are so used to, basically being oppressed to the point, linguistically oppressed to the point that maybe they don't feel safe, maybe they don't feel comfortable, maybe they, have experience in the past that nobody is willing to get a resource for them in their own language. We've kind of created as a society this sort of scenario in which people are just maybe not comfortable speaking their native languages, and that's something to me that's really heartbreaking. As someone who has lived in various different countries where I don't speak the language, I can't imagine how just awful I mean, I can imagine a little bit, but it must be awful to be in a situation where you really need to understand what's going on because you're ill or your family's ill, or you need some kind of a procedure, right? And so that's, at the end of the day, that's why we do what we do, because we want those people who are in those situations, whether it's they're going through childbirth or have just been diagnosed with a serious illness, we want them to have the ability to understand everything in their native languages. And that's why we do, all of us at NCIHC, why we do what we do. We understand the importance of that. But just to take it a step further and do what we've already done with a lot of these more dominant languages like Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, continue that work even further down to make sure that if somebody is speaking in Spanish, but they have limited Spanish proficiency, we don't just leave it there. We go further and we get them the resource that they truly need. So don't give up, I guess, is kind of the message here. Don't be satisfied or be complacent with, we're doing the best we can. I think that there's always more that we can do. In fact, I know, especially with indigenous languages, there's so much work that we can do to improve that. So keep going. And if you're an interpreter of indigenous languages, I know how tough it is, especially where there's typically not enough demand for you to be that's your full-time job. Most of our interpreters are doing it in addition to another job, or in addition to being a mother to, 3 or 4 children full-time. So I guess my other message would just be to say thank you so much to all of you who are giving of your time and your energy to do a work that's really difficult and often very thankless. So thank you so much for your dedication to making sure that all of our brothers and sisters that speak different languages can have the same rights and dignities that we all would want to have.
Very, very well said, Jace. Well, excited for this next chapter here with the LLD Work Group, and excited to be able to be with you here, and really excited for what's to come. So for everyone else listening, stay tuned. Jace will have more information being shared out, more resources, more volunteer opportunities to come. So stay tuned for more, and Jace, super excited for this next chapter for you.
Thanks a lot, David. Really excited as well.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. All right. We'll talk to everyone soon.